welcome back. I would first encourage everyone to, as this is a teaching from the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, if you would like to share in this intention, this would be a traditional intention to bring to this practice. Thinking, may I, having heard this teaching, put it into practice in order to bring all sentient beings beyond all states of suffering and into the state of liberation in union with the perfection of wisdom, the Great Mother. And the perfection of wisdom is referred to as the Great Mother because it is this wisdom, from this wisdom that all Buddhas are born, that whoever comes to discern, whoever comes to realize, to embody, or you could even say to uncover this wisdom, which is, from one perspective, our very nature, whoever uncovers that nature, whoever makes that nature manifest, that person then becomes a Buddha. So that's why this is called the Heart Sutra. It is the heart of the wisdom of all the Buddhist texts, and it's called the Mother because it is from this wisdom that all Buddhas are born. So if I eventually attain enlightenment, it will be through realizing or through manifesting this wisdom. Same for you, the same for anyone, that this wisdom is the gateway, you could say, the heart essence, the very nature of the Buddhist teachings, the innermost nature of the Buddhist teachings. And that's why in certain texts, for example, in the Way of the Bodhisattva, when talking about all of the other kind of practices, in that particular context, he's talking about the practice of the six perfections. Shantideva refers to the first five perfections of generosity, discipline, diligence, diligence, patience, and meditative concentration, those first five, as branches that the Buddha taught for the purpose of wisdom. And without wisdom, not only do those first five not even attain the name perfection, but they alone cannot bring you to the state of enlightenment. So it is only with this wisdom, this perfection of wisdom, you could say, that one could attain enlightenment and eradicate all states of suffering. So for those of you who were not here in past sessions, this is actually part 3 of a 3-part series, so I would ask you to please bear with me if you are new to Buddhism entirely, and especially new to the topic of the Heart Sutra or the philosophy of emptiness, because this will be a quite heavy first session if this is your first dose ever of Buddhist philosophy. So I will do my best to accommodate and even in brief go through all of the words of the sutra again, but that's not really my purpose tonight. My purpose is to go a little bit deeper into the meaning of the union of the two truths, the union of emptiness and compassion, and then also I would like to provide a longer than normal chunk of time for Q&A tonight, because I know there are a lot of questions and doubts about the philosophy of emptiness. So, that being the case, Jessica will provide, or maybe already has provided, the link, if you don't already have yet, it's there in the chat, to this text, the translation that I'm using, which is from the 84,000 Project. And if any of you are unfamiliar, if those of you have been to my teachings a lot before, you probably heard me saying again and again and again things about the 84,000 Project. But it is a very important project that is happening right now to translate all of the collected works of the Buddha into English with new, modern, really excellent quality translations. And that's the translation that we're going to be using tonight. That website has, through that website, you can access an enormous free library of the teachings of the Buddha. So, that being the case, let's come around to the actual text of the Heart Sutra. And so I'm going to go through this quite quickly. So for those of you who this is, like I said, your first session, I would encourage you to go back if you are so inclined, if this feels inspiring to you after this session, to go back and listen to the first 2 talks, because this is going to be very much a icing on the cake, you might say, or kind of fine-tuning of topics we've already discussed. So, homage to the perfection of wisdom, the Blessed Mother. Thus did I hear at one time, So thus did I hear at one time is referring to one of the Buddha's disciples, most likely Ananda or Shariputra, who wrote down this text after the fact. So it's, this is the introduction. The Blessed One, referring here to the Buddha, was residing on Vulture Peak Mountain at Rajgira, together with a great sangha of monks and a great sangha of bodhisattvas. So Rajgir is a place in modern-day Bihar. There's a mountain there called Vulture Peak Mountain. You can still go there today. And a great sangha of monks just means a great gathering. The word sangha means people who are, or a group of people who are united in their interest in or their endeavor in virtuous practices, or you could say in the Dharma. And a great sangha of bodhisattvas. So there was monks, nuns, and here the reason that they're distinguishing bodhisattvas from monks is that in early depictions and early ways of talking about the bodhisattva teachings, they were talking about them as more directed towards lay people, people who live in the world, who may have jobs, responsibilities, families, and so forth, as opposed to the renunciate monastic culture. So a monastic can also be a bodhisattva, but when they distinguish it in this way, monks versus bodhisattvas, that's what they're referring to. So if you look at the early depictions or some paintings of bodhisattvas like Manjushri, Tara, Vajrapani, Avalokiteshvara, they're always wearing layperson's clothes, like silken robes and jewelry and crowns and things like that, things that are inappropriate for monastics to wear or even possess. So anyway, that's kind of a side point. But anyway, at that time, the Blessed One rested in an absorption on the categories of phenomena called illumination of the profound. So in this moment, the Buddha is meditating. That's all we really need to know right now. And if you read into the title, Illumination of the Profound, you might read that this profound word actually is almost always referring to emptiness. When you read in Buddhist texts, sometimes you'll hear about the profound versus the extensive teachings. Profound teachings almost always refers to emptiness, and the extensive tradition or extensive teachings often refers to the stages of practice or realization of that emptiness. So more of the experiential aspect versus the emptiness aspect. So profound, you can almost always read emptiness when you hear the word profound in a Buddhist text. Unless they're just describing something as profound. I had a profound experience. It doesn't necessarily mean emptiness, but in this context. So, at the same time, the Bodhisattva, great being, noble Avalokiteshvara, was practicing the great profound perfection of wisdom and looked and saw the five aggregates are also empty of an intrinsic nature. So Avalokiteshvara, close disciple of the Buddha, was meditating together with the Buddha, basically looking upon the five aggregates, which are five components of our experience, the five components of, we could say, who we think we are when we think I, when I think me or Justin. I think of five things, and this is going to be a main topic here, so I'll go through that when we get to it. But I'm going quite quickly now because this is a review from the last two sessions. Then, due to the Buddha's power, the Venerable Shariputra asked the Bodhisattva, the great being, noble Avalokiteshvara. So Shariputra is another student here who's watching them meditate, and now he wants to ask Avalokiteshvara, how do I do that, basically? So he says, how should sons of a noble family or daughters of a noble family train if they wish to engage in the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom? The Bodhisattva, the great being, noble Avalokiteshvara, replied to the Venerable, I don't know how to pronounce this properly, I'm not a Sanskritist, but it's another version of the name Shariputra, so I'm just going to say Shariputra. Shariputra, sons of noble family or daughters of noble family who wish to engage in the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom should see things in this way. They should correctly observe the five aggregates to be empty of an intrinsic nature. Okay, so now we have to stop and talk about what does it mean to be empty of an intrinsic nature. And this is the entire topic of the perfection of wisdom, the entire topic of the Heart Sutra. Because from now on, basically, they're just going to say that things are empty and not really explain why they're empty. And that's why the Heart Sutra is quite a challenging text. Amongst the, what we call perfection of wisdom teachings, it is one of the shortest ones. And being the shortest, that means it's a condensation that in the longer ones, things are more spelled out. There's more extensive explanations. And the Heart Sutra can be very challenging because it doesn't really explain why things are empty. It just says that they are. It explains a little bit in the next line that we're coming to. But it doesn't really say why things are empty. So we have to talk for a moment about that. So what does it mean to be empty? I'll give a simple example upon which this teaching is based. So this teaching is based, you could say, or this teaching, the intended recipient of this teaching is someone who has already looked at and looked into and discovered the lack of an intrinsic self in terms of a personal identity, the seemingly intrinsically existing I or me. So the way that they look to see that, or might investigate to find if this me intrinsically exists or not, would be to look at, according to the Buddha, when we think me or I, we look at this thing called the 5 aggregates that he was describing here. So he already mentioned the 5 aggregates, and now he's going to say it again. Actually, the list of the 5 aggregates comes in just a moment, but anyway, the list is: there is no form, no feeling, no perception, no formations, no consciousness. Those are the 5 aggregates. It's a couple lines after where we are right now. At any rate, the point is, when he says there's no form, when you're looking at yourself, one of the ways that we identify the self is through I am my body, or I think of my body when I think I. Another way is I think of my feelings, and here feeling means more like bare sensory feelings, like, dislike, pleasant, displeasant, or pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. So anytime I see something, think of something, or experience something, I either have a feeling of pleasantness, unpleasantness, or neutrality. And I also identify with those feelings. Third, we have perception. Perception is often talked about as kind of your identities, or the ways that you identify things. Like, I'm Justin, I'm a translator, I'm a teacher. In relation to my father, I'm a son. In relation to my sister, I'm a brother. So on and so forth. Maybe even things that I think about myself. I'm a good person, I'm a bad person, I'm smart, I'm stupid, whatever. All of these things that we think form something of our identity. Similarly, formations. Formations often has something to do with your emotional content, but it also has to do with your intentions and somewhat your actions. So those are another way that we identify. And then finally, no consciousness. So consciousness here is often thinking more about our thinking mind. So we identify with our thoughts. Now, if I were looking for where am I, and I investigate these 5 things, what I might find is that I have my body, my feelings, my identities or perceptions, my emotions and actions and intentions, my thoughts, but where's the me that supposedly possesses or controls all these things? Just think about that for a minute. Where is the me that supposedly owns the body, or thinks the thoughts, or owns the thoughts, or controls the mind, or controls the feelings, or experiences the feelings even? Where is it? So the Buddha would say that when you investigate, you can't find it. It's just an idea that we have. And based on that idea, we experience all the varieties of suffering of samsara. And the way to escape samsara, the way to overcome suffering, is to not just intellectually know that there's no independently existing self, but to meditate on that and uproot the fixation or the grasping that we have that wants to believe, or that ignorantly grasps to a seemingly independently existing self. So the next step is, if you've realized that, and what you would get from realizing that is an end of your own personal suffering, but not complete enlightenment. And that's the starting off point from this Heart Sutra. Is now the Buddha's not going to talk about the absence of the self. He's going to talk about how the individual aggregates themselves also don't exist independently. So, Mipam Rinpoche, in a text called The Beacon of Certainty, he gives this example, that to realize the absence of the self, you don't have to realize that the aggregates themselves don't independently exist. You only have to realize that you are imagining a self on the basis of those aggregates. You don't actually have to understand that the body isn't independently existing. You can still believe the body exists independently, your mind exists independently, and overcome the fixation on the self. The example that he gives is a common example in Buddhist texts, that if you see in a dark room a curled up rope that's kind of striped, you could think it's a snake and get scared. And to overcome your fear of the snake, all you have to realize is that there's no snake there and that it's just a rope. You don't have to realize that the rope is emptiness. So similarly, to realize that there's no inherently existing self, all you have to realize is that there was never inherently existing self in the aggregates. You don't have to realize that the aggregates themselves also don't inherently exist. But to become a Buddha, you have to realize that all phenomena don't inherently exist, and that only realizing the absence of the personal self will only get you to the state of what we call arhatship, which means the state of the end of your own personal experience of suffering, but not the omniscient state of a Buddha. I could get into more reasoning about why that is the case. I feel like it gets very dry and academic at this point, and I don't really want to go down that line of thinking, so I want to kind of move forward so that we can get into more of what I intended to talk about tonight. So I'm just kind of trying to give a bit of a review for those of you who weren't here last time. So now he gets into form is empty, emptiness is form, emptiness is not other than form is also not other than emptiness. So what he's saying here is when we say form is empty, that's talking about in the same way that I said the self doesn't exist. If I look at a form, let's just take my body for example, that is a form. The body is empty. What that means is the body is not an inherently existing thing. When we say inherently existing, one way that we can think about that is through a lens of independently existing. That it is not an independent entity. It is dependent upon, we could say, parts. That's the easiest way to look at this. That in the same way that I looked at the self and I tried to find the self and all I can find is a bunch of pieces of things that I identify as a self, also I can look at the body and I can say the body has arms, has organs, skin, bones, flesh, blood, all these things. But where is the body above and beyond all of those pieces? I'm just giving you the answers right now, but ideally you would go through this examination for yourself. Think about it and come to this experience for yourself. Right now we don't have time for that. This isn't a Vipassana meditation session. We don't have time for that, but essentially, I just kind of have to move us along, give you a little space to maybe contemplate and move along. But essentially the idea is that the body doesn't exist aside from its parts, and it's just a conceptual imputation that we put on top of a bunch of parts. Again, if you want to keep going down that rabbit hole, even the parts don't inherently exist. The bones, the flesh, the blood, so on and so forth. So that's the first. Form is empty. Now we come to emptiness is form. What does that mean? So in some commentaries, one way of talking about this is that an awakened being, like a being who has realization, they see the thing that I, as an unenlightened person, think is a body, and they say that thing that you think is a body is emptiness. So that's how they explain the first form is empty. Then when they say emptiness is form, it's like from the perspective of that realized person, they're like almost giggling, like ha ha ha, these unenlightened people, they're seeing that thing that's emptiness and they think it's a form. Like they think it's an inherently existing, independently existing thing. So when we go back and forth in this way, what this is showing us is that emptiness isn't something that's separate from the thing that we think is form. It's the very nature of form. So form, the thing that we're thinking of conventionally as a body, for example, when we say it's empty, what it means is it doesn't inherently exist. However, to the unenlightened person, that thing which its nature is emptiness still appears to us as a body. It still appears as a form. So what it's saying is that emptiness is not some separate thing over there, like off in a void somewhere, that's separate from this physical body, For example, if I'm talking about emptiness, I have to be talking about the emptiness of something. It's not a separate thing that lives off over there out in space on its own. It is the very nature of all things, or the particular thing that you're trying to investigate or understand the nature of. So in the current context of the body, when I'm talking about emptiness, I'm talking about the very nature, the fact that this thing doesn't inherently exist. That is its emptiness. So then going further, emptiness is not other than form, form is not other than emptiness, is just kind of reinforcing the inseparability, that there is no form without emptiness, there is no emptiness without form. So this is what's called the fourfold application of emptiness. And if you want to hear a longer teaching just on this topic, there's a video on the Awam Garden of 1000 Buddhas YouTube page called Emptiness. It's also mostly about the Heart Sutra, but really goes into this topic in detail. So I don't have time to go down that line of thinking again. We already discussed this in the first video of this series. So now he says, in the same way, feeling, perception, formation, and consciousness are empty. So what he's saying there is form is empty, emptiness is form, emptiness is not other than form, form is not other than emptiness. Then you can apply that in the same way. Feeling is emptiness, emptiness is feeling, feeling is not other than emptiness, emptiness is not other than feeling. And the same goes for perception, formation, and consciousness. So these are the 5 aggregates. Form, feeling, perception, formation, and consciousness. So what he's saying is, not only is the self empty, we're taking that as a basis, like the ground from which this conversation even started. Even the things that we impute or imagine the idea of a self on are also not inherently existing. They're also emptiness. Okay? We'll have a lot of time for questions, so I'm kind of zipping through here so that we can make time. Sorry. Shariputra, therefore all phenomena are emptiness. They are without characteristics, unborn, unceasing, without stains, without absence of stains, not deficient, and not complete. So, here, 1 second. So now you're thinking, okay, all of this maybe like samsaric things. I don't know if we're talking in technical terms, like the 5 aggregates you could say are phenomena of samsara. Unborn and unceasing. This is a whole nother kind of philosophical way of speaking that what it means to say unborn is that when we say something is born from another thing, that's also something that could only happen or only be talked about with reference to conditions, I guess you would say. And when we're talking about refuting so-called inherent existence, what that means is that our mind's kind of autopilot subconscious way of seeing things is as if they inherently exist. So what it's saying is there's no inherently existing birth. This is a complicated philosophy, and I'm sorry if this is a little bit like mental gymnastics, but what it's saying is that our ordinary way of thinking is that things, that even the idea of arising or being born is also like some kind of inherently existing phenomena, that it also doesn't rely upon conditions. Of course, when we stop and think about it, we know that's not true. If something arises, it has to arise from a cause. As someone who accepts the principle of cause and effect or basic scientific principles. But our mind's autopilot kind of subconscious way of perceiving the world, according to the Buddha, is that we see things is as if they did not depend upon conditions, as if they are independently existing. So what he's saying when he says it's unborn, it's inherently unborn, meaning there's no like inherently existing birth. I'll give you an example that maybe this will help a little bit. Maybe this will just confuse you more. I don't know. I'm just going to give it a shot. All right. Let's see. What's a good... Something like this. Can you see this? Can we see... Maybe you can't really see the lines on this. There are a lot of lines on this, but you can't really see the lines. Okay, we'll use this as an example. Take any action, any verb, okay? I'm going to use going as an example here because this is from Nagarjuna's entry to the middle way. He says that when we think something goes, it's actually just a mental imagination that something goes anywhere. The reason he says that is that, let's say I'm trying to go from here to here, okay? Let's say this is Montana and this is New York City. All right? So what he says is that which has gone does not go. What that means is if it has gone, having gone is something that happened in the past. If it happened in the past, it no longer exists in the present. So someone just raise your hand when I should stop going. Anyone, raise your hand, someone. Okay, Otis. All right, from here to here, did I go? Otis, turn your mic on, just answer me. Let's just play a game. Don't try to be smart about it, just answer the question straightforward. Did I go? Did I go?
Or when? Yes.
Okay, so am I going right now?
No.
But I went.
Yes.
So where is the going?
In the past.
And the past doesn't exist, right?
Right.
From the perspective of right now.
Correct.
So now if I keep going, where's the going?
Now.
Anywhere that you try and say now, the going happened in the past. So the idea of going is just something our mind constructs. It doesn't exist. It's a mentally constructed fiction. That's the idea, is that anything that has gone does not go. Without having gone, there's also no going. Like there's no movement. So there's no option. Basically, the idea is that anything that we try to say about it is actually just a mental creation that doesn't exist in reality. And in reality, what I mean is like that without the overlay of the conceptual mind creating an idea of what it is, does it really exist? And that's what Buddha's refuting. So like when we say inherently existing or inherently born, you could say the same thing. Like there's this process of arising from a cause, and anywhere in there it's like either already arisen or not yet arisen. Not yet arisen is in the future, it doesn't exist. Already arisen is in the past, it also doesn't exist. It's something that happened in the past. Like, I know this is very philosophical and bizarre sounding, but like my going or my having gone to the ranch from Missoula, coming to the Montana, the ranch up here, that's something that happened in the past and as a matter of fact no longer exists. We can talk about it as a historical fact, but the actual going doesn't exist anymore. So that's what we're talking about. That it doesn't inherently exist. It's just something that conditionally we can talk about through the lens of concept. And that kind of idea or that situation of talking through the lens of concept and imaginary kind of ideas of solidifying things is the reason why we suffer and the reason why we're ignorant and not omniscient Buddhas. So anyway, he says, not unborn and unceasing. So if it never arose in the first place, it can't cease. Like, for example, in a dream, this is an example that's given in a lot of Buddhist texts. Let's say in a dream, I dream of being a woman and I have a child, I have a baby, and then in the dream that baby gets sick and then dies. The baby was never born in the first place, so it can't die. That's what they're talking about here, unborn and unceasing. If it was never born in the first place, then it never abided and then it could never cease. So, continuing on, they are without characteristics, unborn, unceasing, without stains. So this is a way of talking, okay, you think samsara doesn't truly exist. What about nirvana? Because when we talk about nirvana, we call it stainless, or it's an unstained state, unstained by the faults of samsara or the karma and the afflictive emotions, something like that. So now he's going to say that it's without stains, but also without the absence of stains, meaning that with stains, without stains, that's also just more concepts. So it's beyond what you could think of it, not deficient and not complete. So I'm not going to go into every word commentary because I'm going to take an hour to do that. So Shariputra, therefore in emptiness, there's no feeling, no form, no feeling, no perception, no formations, no consciousness. Now this is an important point. He says, in emptiness, these things don't exist. It doesn't mean that they absolutely don't exist. Of course, I can still talk about my body and you're going to know what I'm talking about. Like, if I go to the doctor and I have a sore elbow, I can say, "Doctor, my elbow hurt." And conventionally, like, we're going to have successful communication. It's not like I'm not negating the conventional experience of having a body. What the Buddha is negating is this kind of exaggerated sense of inherent existence of the body, through having that exaggerated sense of importance or significance or reality, we create all kinds of ideas and experience all kinds of thoughts and emotions and karma in relation to those things because of those imagined ideas. So, and even when we say, going back, we say there is no form, no feeling, no perception, no formation, no consciousness, no eye, no ears, no tongue, no body, no mind, no form, no sound, no smell, no taste, no texture, no mental object. All of these things, when they say no, you can also apply the same above mentioned fourfold logic. Emptiness is I is emptiness. Emptiness is I. Emptiness is not other than I is not other than emptiness. Ear is emptiness. Emptiness is ear. Ear is not other than emptiness. Emptiness is not other than ear. So it's not a mere negation. It's saying that the very nature of these things is emptiness. Out of emptiness they appear. Because they're empty, they can appear, you could say. And as they appear, they are empty, meaning they don't inherently exist. But that doesn't mean they can't appear to our deluded mind. So, the main point that I'm trying to make when I say that is that the Buddha's teaching of emptiness is not a nihilistic denial that would lead to a denial of cause and effect, or denial of our own personal responsibility, or a denial even of our subjective experience of happiness and sorrow. It's that the exaggerated sense of seemingly independent existence or something like that, that's what's being kind of rejected or denied, you could say, not the conventional appearance of things. So basically here now it's saying that there's not only no object of these senses, there's not only no sense organs like your eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. There's also no object of those things that inherently exists. Similarly, there is no element of the eye up to element of the mind, further no element of the mind consciousness. So this is referring to, we can talk about when we talk about experience, I guess you could say, there's 18 factors you could talk about. One is the eye itself. Secondly, the eye itself being the sense organ. Then we have the eye consciousness, which is your aspect of your consciousness that experiences visual forms. And then you have the physical things that you see themselves. So those are one, eye consciousness, eye object, which is physical form. That's three. You have each of those three for each of your six senses, you could say. Your eye, ear, nose, tongue, tactile, bodily kind of sensation, your skin sensations, and then your mental, concept, like your thinking mind. So for each of those you have three. That makes what we call the 18, dhatus, anyway, technical term. But the point is that not only do the objects of experience not inherently exist, neither does the consciousness that experiences them or the sense organs that are the basis for those experiences. So what they're going through is basically just saying that everything that you think exists or that you feel exists or that is the basis for your ordinary experience, none of it exists in and of itself. None of it is inherently or independently existing. There is no suffering, there is no ignorance and no exhaustion of ignorance up to aging and death, and no exhausting of aging and death. So this is talking about the 12 links of interdependent origination, which is one of the fundamental teachings of the Buddha. Basically that if we have ignorance, then we're eventually going to be born into samsara, eventually going to experience suffering and death. There's a lot more to it than that. If you want to reverse the process of the 12 links of dependent origination, to reverse the process of your experience of samsara, you start by eliminating ignorance or exhausting ignorance. So what he's saying here now is there's not only no 12 links of dependent origination, there's no reversal of the 12 links of dependent origination. Basically, like what could happen is you might think, okay, all this conventional samsaric stuff, none of that's real, but Buddhist teachings are real, or like enlightenment's real, or something like that. And he's trying to say not even that stuff's real. Real in the sense of independently existing. There is no suffering, no origin of suffering, no cessation of suffering, no path, no wisdom, no attainment, no non-attainment. So the suffering, origin, cessation, and path, this is referring to the Four Noble Truths, primary teaching of the Buddha. Also saying that also doesn't inherently exist. It's also a dependent phenomena. No path, no wisdom that you would attain. You know, ordinarily you would think that you're going to attain or develop some kind of wisdom through practicing this path. The Buddha is saying even that doesn't inherently exist. There's no attainment. Okay, you think, okay, there's no attainment, so maybe there's a non-attainment, but not even that. So he's trying to go through every possibility that your mind might try to muster up to try and solidify something, something to hold on to. And yeah, Shariputra, therefore, since the bodhisattvas have no attainment, they rely upon and dwell in the perfection of wisdom. Because their minds have no veils, they have no fear. Having utterly gone beyond error, they reach the culmination of nirvana. So, this is a pretty deep statement. I'm just going to let it stand and read through because we have to move on. But in the past videos, I talked about this. All the Buddhas who reside in the three times have likewise fully awakened to unsurpassable and perfect awakening by relying upon the perfection of wisdom. So I'll just say one brief thing about this. I already said basically that we talk about this as the mother because all Buddhas will awaken to Buddhahood through this wisdom. And the reason why goes back to what I was saying before, that it is through seeing the lack of intrinsic existence or inherent existence that one is freed from suffering. Now, I didn't get into one thing that I'll mention just briefly here, that the reason, if we're talking philosophically, that seeing the emptiness of all phenomena, rather than just seeing the emptiness of the self, leads to a higher level of attainment, is that the main obstacle, you could say, we say Buddhas are omniscient, that Buddhas know everything. And if I still believed that anything in the world still independently exists, then I can't see the causation and the web of interdependent conditions that lead to the appearance of that single thing, because I'm solidifying it, thinking that it exists independently. So that means I'm going to be ignorant of the interdependent web of circumstances of that thing that I still think is somehow truly or independently existing. So that is a veil of ignorance, you could say, of preventing me from seeing reality as it is, or seeing the fullness of interdependent reality. So once I see that all phenomena are interdependent, that nothing exists in an independent way, then I can be awakened to the knowledge of all things, not only in their nature, but also in their variety, in their conventional variety or expression of their causes and conditions. So that's why they say that one has to attain full enlightenment, the omniscient state of Buddhahood that is the most beneficial to all beings, not only to yourself, that one would have to realize the emptiness of all phenomena and not only the emptiness of the personal self, of the I or the me. Okay. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom is the great... the mantra of the perfection of wisdom is the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra that is equal to the unequaled, and the mantra that utterly pacifies all suffering. Since it is not false, it should be known to be true. So therefore, the mantra of the perfection wisdom is the mantra of great knowledge. This could also be translated, this word knowledge, as awareness. And it's called the mantra of great awareness because it is the mantra that destroys unawareness. It destroys ignorance. So by calling it the mantra of knowledge, you could say it's the mantra of overcoming a lack of knowledge or overcoming your ignorance, something like that. the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra that is equal to the unequaled. So the unequaled refers to Buddhahood, or the state of enlightenment. So calling this mantra the equal to the unequaled means that this mantra is like expressing the wisdom of the Buddhas. So that's one way that this mantra or any mantra could be used. Is like, so in one commentary, in Dzongtsar Khyentse Rinpoche, he's talking about this mantra. And he says, we can't sit around meditating on emptiness all the time. I mean, some people can, but most of us are not going to be able to. So another way that we can try to kind of embody the wisdom of the perfection of wisdom is by reciting this mantra. So that's kind of the point of the mantra. If the mantra is expressing, or kind of, you could even think of the mantra that the mantra literally is the nature expressed in sound of the wisdom of the Buddhas. And when you recite that, it's like, could be, he explains it as poking holes in your seemingly, like, your experience of a seemingly solid reality. So the mantra of the perfection of wisdom is stated thus: Tadyata gate gate paragate parasamgate bodhisoha. So tadyata means it's like this, something like that. And then there's various ways that this mantra is explained. I'll give you two. In that commentary, Khyentse Rinpoche, he says that gate means kind of the experience of form as emptiness. Or the first gate is form as emptiness. The second gate is emptiness as form. Paragate is form is not other than emptiness. Parasamgate is emptiness is not other than form. So it's expressing that fourfold, what we call the fourfold application of emptiness. Bodhisattva means enlightenment, so it is, or something like that. Basically, like, enlightenment is here, or is imminent, something like that. So another way of talking about this is it's saying, like, these are kind of progressive, it's expressing the progression of your experience of emptiness. So another way of talking about the progression of a person experiencing emptiness is through the lens of something called the 5 paths. I mentioned this briefly in the last teaching, that there's something called the path of accumulation, the path of joining, the path of seeing, and the path of meditation, and then finally the path of no more learning. And these are talked about as maybe 5 different ways, or maybe you could think of them as proximities of your mind to emptiness. So on the path of accumulation, which is the first of those paths, you're maybe more studying about emptiness. So your idea of it is still very much conceptual, not even experiential, still very much an idea. So one way I've seen some teachers explain this is it's like, imagine the first level, it's like a drawing that you drew based on something someone else told you about what the moon looks like. And then the second one is like the reflection of the moon in a mirror. So it's like still not the real moon. You're still not seeing it directly, but it's kind of the real moon, something like that. But it's like being filtered through your mind, something like that. Then the third, the path of seeing, is like you're actually seeing the moon, like directly with your own eyes. The path of meditation is like you're on a spaceship flying closer and closer to the moon. The path of meditation, sorry. And then the path of no more learning is like you're standing on the moon, something like that. So this is just a rough example, and this is a modern example. This isn't in traditional texts, but the idea is that in the early stages, you're learning about meditation through a book, through your teacher, whatever. It's a rough idea in your head of what emptiness might be. It still could be helpful to learn that. I'm not saying it's not helpful, but it's not a like direct access kind of point. You're not directly experiencing emptiness in the way that I'm directly seeing this computer. It's like filtered through a lot of concept. Then as I refine that concept and begin meditating, I start having like maybe a little bit more of a genuine experience of what emptiness is in my mind. It's like it's actually giving me some kind of effect in my mind. I'm having an experience that's more true to me. It's not just a concept anymore. It's kind of like, well, let me forget that example. Anyway, then finally, as I build that experience more and more, I have what's called realization. So this is the difference between realization and experience. Realization is a direct vision of emptiness. And what does it mean to be a direct vision? It means that there's no longer an experience of a me seeing emptiness. So this is going to be a little far out. For those of you who are already like meditating on emptiness or studying about emptiness, this can be clarifying maybe. But when we see something as emptiness, what we're seeing is that it's not anything that we could think about. We have gone beyond the concept, because when I'm looking for example, this body, and I don't find it, I just find parts, I'm left in an absence. I'm left in a seeing of the unseeable, something like that, that there wasn't something there to see in the first place, and I experienced that ineffable reality. In that moment, we could say that the self, or the body in this moment, is free from all concept. It's free from anything I could think about it. And then my mind is directly experiencing a state free from any concept. And in that state, there's no difference, there's no separation between subject and object. That's what's referred to as direct experience, or direct realization, I should say. So that's what we call the path of seeing. That's like seeing the actual moon directly. Then as you get more and more used to that, and that could happen very quickly, the path of meditation is sometimes described as very quick, like super quick, depending on the person's practice or their capacity of bodhicitta, the methods they're using, whatever. Anyway, then the last, the culmination of the perfection of that direct experience of emptiness is Buddhahood, full enlightenment. So that's the other way that this mantra is explained, that gate gate means moving from the path of accumulation to the path of joining. Paragate is the path of seeing. Parasamgate expresses the path of meditation and into Buddhahood. So that's the other way that this is explained. So anyway, either way, you can think of it as just expressing like the movement towards a full experience of emptiness into enlightenment. Yeah. All right. I'm saying way more than I intended, and this is taking longer than I thought, so I might just have to open at the end for questions. Shariputra, this is the way a bodhisattva, great being, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom. So again, this is Avalokiteshvara talking. One thing I didn't mention, but I mentioned in past teachings, is that often when we hear the word sutra, we think that it is the teachings of the Buddha. That's often what that word means. But there is a kind of sutra, a variety of authoritative words of the Buddha, which is called by the blessing of the Buddha. There's another one called the actual words of the Buddha. And then there's another category of words that is called with permission by the Buddha. And all three of those are complete in the Heart Sutra. So at the very beginning, when it said, "Thus I have heard at the Vulture's Peak mountain on Rajgir, a great gathering of monks and a great gathering of bodhisattvas were gathered," that's an example of speech authorized by the Buddha. So the Buddha didn't say that, but he told the people who were collecting the sutras they could include that type of context. Anyway, this is just extra fluff maybe, but it's important for some of you. And then later, Avalokiteshvara and Shariputra start having a conversation. The Buddha's not teaching, but at the very beginning it said, "By the power of the Buddha," blah, 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 this conversation started. So the Buddha inspired them through him sitting there in meditation and emptiness, inspired them to have this conversation. So this is still considered, kind of the inspired words of the Buddha, even though the Buddha wasn't speaking. So that's how this is still categorized as a sutra. Shariputra, this is the way a bodhisattva, great being, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom. Then the Blessed One arose from that absorption and gave his approval to the bodhisattva, great being, noble Avalokiteshvara, saying, right here after saying, when he says excellent, this is the first time we have the actual words of the Buddha, that third category of Buddha's words. So if we have actual words of the Buddha, words by the blessing of the Buddha, words authorized by the Buddha. So he says, excellent, excellent, son of noble family, it's like that. Son of noble family, it's like that. The profound perfection of wisdom should be practiced just as you have taught, and even the thus gone ones will rejoice. Thus gone ones is another way of, or epithet, another word for a Buddha. So thus is a word, means kind of like suchness, just as it is, reality as it is. So one way of talking about a Buddha is to say a Buddha is one who has gone into, or has gone to the experience, or their experience has become one of suchness, something like that. So, when the Blessed One had said this, the Venerable Sarasvatiputra, Shariputra, that's another name for Shariputra, the Bodhisattva, great being, noble Avalokiteshvara, and the entire assembly, as well as the world with its devas, humans, asuras, gandharvas, rejoiced and praised what the Blessed One had said. So all of these other categories of beings, devas, asuras, gandharvas, this is all different categories of beings that you may or may not believe exist that are talked about in all the ancient Indian texts. So devas is a kind of gods, but not God in the Judeo-Christian sense, just another realm of being, you might say. Asuras and Gandharvas also, yeah, we don't need to get too much into that. If you want to read it, you can Google those terms and read the histories. At any rate, it's saying that the Buddha approved. He said, yeah, exactly what you said. Right on, bro. To Avalokiteshvara. And then that concludes the Great Vehicle Sutra, the heart of the perfection of wisdom, the Blessed Mother. Okay, so now I want to move on just a little bit to a few points that I wanted to make, talking a little bit more in detail about the union of appearance and emptiness and the union of emptiness and compassion. So from one perspective, when we're talking about compassion in Buddhism, we're talking about a mind that thinks about the suffering of others and then wishes them to be free of that suffering. So that's a basic definition of compassion in Buddhism. Now, we just got done saying that in this experience of emptiness, there's no me, no you, no suffering, no being, no arisal of suffering, no emptiness of suffering, no beginning of suffering, no end of suffering, all of that. So how does that relate to conventional experience of suffering? How does that relate to an intention to free beings from suffering? It sounds like in the state of emptiness, there could be no intention about anything, right? Now, there's two ways of talking about this. From one, the recognition or the acknowledgement of emptiness is not a denial of the conventional expression of things. It's actually because things are empty that we can experience them in any way whatsoever. So the way to understand that, the way that you might make sense of that, is that to think about what it would be to not be empty. Because that's how our mind kind of fixates on things. If things actually existed in that way, what would that be? So if something actually independently existed, free of causation, what would that look like? It would mean that it was unchanging, permanent. Out of the web of interdependent reality, free of causation, unchanging. So if things were not empty, a seed could not give rise to a sprout. Negative karma could not give rise to an experience of suffering. So it's only because things are empty that any of this can happen, that anything can be perceived, that any experience can happen. But it's because our minds are like exaggerating what's actually there in the sense of kind of viewing or experiencing or fixating on things as if they inherently exist that we suffer in the first place. Exaggerating the sense of what this self is. Because we can talk about the conventional self in the same way I talked about how I can talk about my doctor or my body to the doctor. I can still talk about myself. I can say, hey, Jessica, send me an email, and you know what I'm talking about. I can still refer to this self. However, when I talk about what that self is, it's just an idea. It's just a convenient term, something like that. But that's not how we experience it, and that's why we suffer, because the way that we experience it is as if it really exists on its own terms, in and of itself. So, the idea then is that... let me tell you a really paradoxical statement. I brought this up at the last gathering too, but if those of you that already heard it, the more times you hear it, the better, because it's kind of a tricky thing to hear. The famous quote from Nagarjuna that says, whatever arises from conditions is unarisen. It has the nature of non-arising. This shows you the paradoxical thing that's going on here. What it's saying, whenever Buddhists in the terms of emptiness say something doesn't arise or something is unborn, what they mean is it doesn't inherently arise. It doesn't, arising is not a thing that exists in and of itself. So it only happens through conditions, conditionally, in relation to something else. You can only posit anything in relation to something else. Nothing exists independently, is one way that we're talking here. So when I say that anything that arises from conditions doesn't arise, what I'm saying is anything that arises from conditions doesn't arise in and of itself. So I'm only refuting like an inherently or of its own essence arising, which is the way that our mind perceives of things. So we're kind of rejecting or trying to overcome a misperception of how things arise, not the fact that they do arise conventionally. And that's the same for, you could say, all phenomena. We're not rejecting that, like this table in front of me conventionally exists and can conventionally, when I set this cup on it, that it's going to support the cup, that it's not going to fall through the table and hit the ground. What we're rejecting or kind of trying to overcome through this type of analysis or this type of thinking or ultimately this type of meditation is that the table exists in and of itself, that it is an independently existing phenomena. So now when we want to go further, then we have to talk about the inseparability of appearance and emptiness. So and that's coming to that same point where I said the very fact that things arise from conditions, that shows their emptiness. So like one of the main reasons, there's a lot of like philosophical reasons, if you want to get into the logic of emptiness, why things are empty, they call the king of all reasons is because they're interdependent. So if I wanted to give a logical reason, all phenomena, they are empty because they're interdependent. So the opposite of empty is independently existing. And I think it's fairly easy. This is the problem with emptiness philosophy, is I think it's fairly easy to know that things don't exist independently. Just thinking about that, it seems like a total logical fallacy. It seems pretty easy to understand that the only reason that this book exists is because someone made it. You know, it doesn't exist in and of itself. Like someone had to cut down a tree, process paper, you know, whatever, print these lines on it. Eventually I wrote in it. Like all of those things conditioned this. That's pretty apparent. But that's not the way our minds perceive things on this like intuitive, autopilot, habitual level. So that's I think one of the problems or tricky things about learning about emptiness philosophy is that when you hear it, it just sounds like a bunch of word games, or it just sounds like some kind of abstract philosophy. But that's, I know, kind of one of the reasons why it sounds abstract is, for one, because it's actually quite simple. Like what it is simple. And then for two, because a lot of us just want to intellectualize it and don't meditate on it. And it's through meditating on it that you'll actually gain more conviction in it and experience of it. I think it's once you get into it, once you get into the logic of it, it's fairly easy to see that everything's interdependent. It's almost obvious. You're almost like, well, duh, yeah. You know, it's really not that tricky. But to actually gain experience of that and realize that in a way that's affecting your perception of the world, that's a whole nother story. And so that's why I would really encourage people, of course, to study about emptiness, of course, to learn about the Heart Sutra, but never feel content with an intellectual understanding of emptiness or an intellectual understanding of any principle in Buddhism. I'll just say that like Buddhism didn't exist as an ism or a thing to study when the Buddha was teaching the Heart Sutra. The Buddha was telling Shariputra, look at your mind like this. He wasn't saying study a philosophy about how someone else would look at their mind in this way, you know. Learn intellectually how it might be if you decided to look at your mind and your body and so forth. He said, no, like look at your mind and body in this way. Like develop this as your ongoing experience. This is reality. Not like this is a thing that you could learn about that like some guys might have done 2,600 years ago on a mountain in India, you know? And that's just a way that a lot of us end up approaching the Buddhist teachings. It's like, it's an interesting thing to learn about, to intellectually kind of get into, to kind of like feel a part of it, to like join in on Buddhism. And that's all nice. And it is helpful, like to some extent, gaining an intellectual understanding, but it's not the point at all. The point is to train our minds and really overcome those fixations on a practical level, really gain more states of freedom and understanding, like on a deeper experiential level, to gain those realizations that actually set us into states of freedom and wisdom and unlock, you know, our innermost potential. So that comes around to the idea of the inseparability of emptiness and compassion, which is that there's often a saying that is quoted by many of great masters that is, emptiness has the essence of compassion. And what they mean in that is that in a genuine experience of emptiness, what one experiences is that all of our suffering is actually just because of this misunderstanding of reality. It's just a tiny little mistake of consciousness. And in the expression, the natural expression of that realization is a natural outpouring of compassion for all beings who are essentially suffering needlessly. And so that's how they talk about the enlightened activities of a Buddha. Buddhas don't think. Buddhas don't have a conceptual mind anymore. Once you have transcended and gone into a direct experience of reality, there's no, I want to help this poor pitiable being or something like that. That doesn't exist. It's just a spontaneous outpouring of compassionate activity that meets beings wherever is necessary, in whatever way is necessary. And I would say that even for high-level practitioners who are not fully enlightened, they start acting more and more in that way, like less preconceived ideas of I want to do this or that, and more of a spontaneous kind of outpouring of their experience. It's often talked about like that a lot of, you'll see a lot of great Tibetan masters' writings at the end. It'll say, Gangsar Chibo, like, I wrote whatever came to my mind, like literally like without a preconception of I want to write this about that, just an outpouring, a natural outpouring of text. They often talk about Dogo Khyentse Rinpoche, who is one of our main teachers, Tokosanga Rinpoche's main teachers, that when he taught, it looked like almost like an automatic just outpouring of pure teaching without a second pause to like stop and think, how should I phrase this, or how might I answer that question? Just like really a constant flow of transmission of teaching. So anyway, my point is that compassion doesn't turn one into a zombie or like a blanked out like weirdo who doesn't know how to relate to the world or talk to people, but would give you an even deeper and even more precise understanding of causality, of why people are the way they are, why they're experiencing things the way they are, how to help them in the best way possible, why it is that they're suffering and how we could free them from that suffering. All of those things become ever more clear to a person realizing emptiness, and not the opposite. It's not that they become disconnected from reality, disconnected from people. I don't know if I've met an authentic Buddha. I like to think I have. I like to look at my teachers in that way. But I can tell you that they have attained very, very high states of experience of reality, and none of them are lifeless, dull vegetables. They're amazing, wonderful, funny, compassionate, engaged, beings that are... they're certainly anything but disconnected and anything but, blank. They're expressive and vibrant, and